Welcome to Remember Me by Intervivos, the show about living life to its fullest, leaving a legacy, and deciding how you will be remembered. And now, your humble team of expert planners taking the legal world by storm.
Welcome to Remember Me. I'm Glenn Wagstaff. I'm here with Mike Black, and today we're talking a little bit about Chris Kyle, the American Sniper. We're gonna get a little bit into his story and how he's been remembered since he's passed away, his legacy and his estate. But before we do that, want to invite everybody to join us next week. This is going to be part of a larger discussion where we talk about professionals and, when you go from a life of, more or less obscurity and just being a regular person and becoming somebody who's more famous or well-known and have a larger estate, larger net worth, or even just being a professional in business, a lot of times you have a target painted on you. And so, that's one of the things we wanted to talk about. So we're broadcasting from Salt Lake City, Utah, and just last week, Gwyneth Paltrow was out here skiing. And as she's going down the slopes, there's a man, I want to say he was in his 70s.
He's in his 70s, a retired doctor. I think he's an optometrist or something. So
she bumps into him as she's skiing, and next thing we know, and it's all over the news if you want to look it up, but there's a lawsuit against her for having bumped into him on the slopes, and how much was the lawsuit for? I want to say it was
it's three something million, a little over $3 million.
$3 million for bumping into somebody on the ski slopes. And of course, I don't know whether he sustained injuries or not, but I have to imagine that having a pretty lady bump into you on the ski slopes is not going to cost $3 million of damages.
Well, he explains that it was velocity. She was going out of control, is what he says, and he says a small bullet can make a big hole, and she's not very big, but $3 million worth of hole. I don't know if that's
getting hit even hard, right? Getting knocked out even. And getting shot.
Yes.
But $3 million, I have to imagine that if it was anybody else on the ski slopes, it wouldn't be a case for nearly as much, right? And so what happens...
Might not even be a case at all.
And he probably won't be able to win the case.
Right.
But when you have, fame and money, then that's when people want to come after you. And to an extent, that's what we're talking about today, is the idea that once you have a reputation and once you have a net worth that's a little bit larger, there's a target on you, and I think that's a big worry especially for a lot of professionals. So next week we're going to have a guest on the show, Raymond Ramirez, who's with Revolution Financial Management, and that's exactly what we're going to be talking about with him. Is how do you protect yourself as a professional? How do you plan around some of those financial and legal concerns so that if there were the possibility of litigation against you, that you're protected and you have that asset protection in place? So with that, let's jump into the topic for today. Chris Kyle is known today as the American Sniper, one of the guys from our military that's had the most confirmed kills of any sniper in U.S. history, and he became well known because he wrote his biography and it got published, and up to that point, there's not a lot of stories where we really get that level of insight into not only just the private life of our military members, but also what goes on while they're out in the field. But then it was made into a movie also. Chris was more or less just an everyday person that wouldn't have been recognized on a large scale, other than the fact that once this book got published, it went big. And I never read the book before watching the movie, but I heard so many good things about the movie that I was really excited to watch it. And a couple years ago, saw it for the first time, and really impressed with what they did with it, because what it does is it gives you an inside look to the again the private life of Chris Kyle, and what it may have been like for him throughout his life. I think it's kind of a good portrait. Of course, it was based on the book that he wrote, but also just what our military men and women go through while they're out there, in deployment and having to kind of do the dirty work that keeps us free and safe.
Well, in an interview that he did with, I think it was New York Times, but he mentioned that he didn't bring this book out. He didn't write it to bring glory to him. He brought it out. He wrote this to show the sacrifices of the families of the military people go through. Some of the sacrifice, and one of the reasons he got out of the military is to save his marriage. But he brought that out so he could bring honor to the fallen heroes that didn't get any recognition, and the families of those that serve.
And there's so many sacrifices that go unrecognized, that in particular that our military men and women go through. But I think just watching the movie, and of course it ends. For those of you who haven't heard the movie or watched the movie, not to spoil anything, but it ends with him passing away, and we'll get into that a little bit. It's tragic, but in that respect, I think it really does highlight the sacrifices that everyday families go through, and of course his family had many periods of time, because he did multiple deployments where he was gone, and then even when he came back, of course with post-traumatic stress, with the difference between being out in a war setting and coming back to everyday life. There was probably stretches there also that required a lot of understanding and a lot of just accommodations, right? And
absolutely. I mean, my wife gets upset when people are mean to me, so I can imagine what his wife and his family went through because he was attacked a lot of times, but just the things he was going through, the things he couldn't tell his family either. They had to be very supportive.
Well, and you mentioned your wife. When I come back, because a lot of times I go on work trips and speaking engagements and business opportunities that we sit down with people all over the country, and advisors and so on. When I come back, my kids miss me, and it's hard to be gone for long periods of time. But when our military, go out, sometimes it's for months at a time, sometimes it's for years at a time.
Oh, yeah.
And then when they come back, it's just not the same as when they left, because so much has gone on since, and you haven't seen your kids grow over months, and you've changed and they've changed, and there's a little bit of getting used to everyday life again. That for our military, it's definitely something that isn't recognized enough, but it's a huge sacrifice that the family takes on. And then in Chris's case, again, just being able to see his personal story and kind of how it progressed, and he was just an everyday guy that wanted to be in rodeos,
right,
and
be a cowboy, and
then ended up joining the military and became a Navy SEAL, and then became a sniper, and was very good at what he did. And some people in the military, I think, they go out because they believe in what they're doing, and some stay in for multiple deployments and so on, not just because of themselves, but because of a sense of duty to their team or to their country or to those that they're protecting. And I think that was part of why he did it.
Absolutely. He mentions that a few times too, that he did that because if he didn't do what he did, his boys would get hurt.
So, coming back and everything else, being able to kind of share the story that he did in his memoirs, gives us an insight into a lot of that sort of thing that we probably wouldn't have otherwise. But I just remember, when the book came out, that it became a bestseller and it did really well. And then they made the movie off of it, and the movie, I think, did really well as well. He wrote the book before he passed away and published it, and was around for a little while, while it kind of took off. But then about couple years after the book was published, was when tragically, he passed away, actually, doing service, going out with somebody who was a veteran, kind of, dealing with post-traumatic stress and had some mental disorder, and he was actually murdered as as part of that kind of service he was providing. So when we come back, we'll discuss a little bit more about his story. Thanks for joining us on Remember Me. Welcome back to Remember Me, the show where we talk about leaving a legacy, planning how you'll be remembered, and planning for your future. We're talking about the American sniper, Chris Kyle, and a little bit about his life. And, before the break, we were talking about him passing away tragically. And before he passed away, he had written his memoirs. He had written a biography, and it was a book that became a bestseller. And so one of the things that was actually written in that book was an experience that he had getting in a bar fight with another member of the military, and over some statements that were made that basically sounded like he was saying that that the SEALs sometimes should suffer losses, that they were due for some losses, and of course it was really close to a friend's funeral, and it touched home, and so they got in a fight, and at some point later, it wasn't written in the book, but at some point later, Chris Kyle had indicated that the person in that fight with him was Minnesota Governor Jesse Ventura, and so what ended up happening after that was, of course, a lawsuit for defamation because Mr. Ventura felt that not only was it misrepresented, but also that it was affecting him in the military community. And so,
and Jesse claimed it never happened to begin with. Time and time again, he claims that altercation never happened.
And to be honest, in the book, it doesn't say that it happened with him. Right? The incident may have happened with somebody else, but because Chris Kyle had said at another point, not in the book, but
I think
at another
it was in an
point,
interview that he mentioned that
it was Jesse Ventura, then that's what caused all this problem. So. So shortly before his death, this lawsuit was initiated against Chris Kyle. And, a lot of times we think that when we pass away, that these legal problems disappear and our family doesn't have to worry about it anymore. But actually they don't. And this is a case where the lawsuit continued against Chris Kyle's estate after he died.
Yeah, 4 years after he died.
4 years.
4 years after he passed away. The lawsuit was going on for 5 years, but it was 4 years after he passed away that it was finally settled.
So imagine, being Chris Kyle's wife, being left with, that he still had minor children at the time that he passed away, picking up the pieces of, a broken life when your loved one and breadwinner and everything else is gone, and having to deal with a defamation lawsuit that's continuing for 4 years after his death. And of course, that was one of the things that in the military community, I know just in general, didn't really rub people the right way. Just the thought that that his widow's estate was still having to respond for this claim of defamation that had continued. A lot of times, as professionals and as people who maybe do well for themselves, we worry about lawsuits and making sure that we're protected and that our assets are protected. I think a lot of people forget the fact that can even continue after you're gone.
That's true. I mean, you never know what's going to happen. It's just like any kind of legacy. Things, when somebody dies, the family has to pick up the pieces, and this one can just add, injury to insult afterwards.
Yeah,
insult to injury. Sorry.
So Mike, tell us the rest of the story. I know you've done a lot of research on this. What happened in the lawsuit? How did it resolve? It took 4 years.
Took 4 years.
Obviously, that's impressive and burdensome by itself. But tell us the rest of the story.
Well, apparently Jesse was suing the estate, suing Chris Kyle to begin with, and he was actually, what's the word? They ruled against him, but Jesse wouldn't let it die, so he kept going after him,
So my understanding, so they ruled in his favor,
in Kyle's favor,
but it was overturned on appeal,
right?
And then it was appealed again to state Supreme Court, and then they confirmed that it was overturned, and then he initiated another lawsuit.
Right, and there was the defamation of it. That was part of the defamation.
And then in the end, there ended up being a settlement.
A settlement. It said that one of the things I've been reading, it said that it still went to a jury, and it was a split jury, and it was an 8-2 decision. And they found in favor of Jesse Ventura rather than Chris Kyle.
And defamation suits, for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with the different claims that can happen in a legal setting, there are some claims that are personal claims based on injury or based on somebody's action that has been taken against you or somehow damaged you. And a defamation suit is basically saying that his actions, his representations have affected your reputation, right, and caused harms.
Right, and I think what happened was Jesse, now he says he can't get a job in the U.S. He lost his insurance through the Screen Actors Guild, and he's basically a pariah now. Nobody will touch him other than Russia.
And in the military community, of
yes.
course, it affected the way that people perceived him and what circles he could associate with.
Right. He says he can't even go to those bars anymore, can't associate with them, where he used to feel safe. He feels like he'd have to be looking over his shoulder all the time. Doesn't know who's going to throw him under the bus.
So it's interesting because he went into this lawsuit with the intention of protecting his character and establishing the fact that, somebody had said something damaging against him, so he wanted his reputation to stay intact. And I think the opposite, in a lot of ways, was true, that by pursuing this, he negatively affected his reputation more than if he would have just dropped it.
Right, and that's something we've got to learn, just let things go sometimes.
Interestingly, if we look at Chris Kyle and his legacy and how he'll be remembered, what do you think he'll be remembered for?
He'll be remembered as an American hero. I mean, he was a good father. In one of the interviews, he says, I don't want to be remembered as a killer. I want to be remembered as a good father and other things. A good father, good husband. And I think that's what the kind of reputation he has. Whereas you look at Jesse, what's he going to be remembered as?
As of now.
As of now. Everything he's done is basically
spot, right?
Big old black eye for Jesse.
But, back to Chris Kyle, the way that we remember him, as a public, will largely be based on his book, on his the movie that was made from the book, and when we think about the sacrifices that are made in the military, it's one of the few instances that we've really gotten an in-depth look and understanding of the private life of somebody in his type of position.
He did say in an interview that it's frowned upon to go public like this. So he was taking a chance to bring this forward and let people know what really goes on behind the scenes that nobody knows about.
And I think one of the things that's worth mentioning is, over time, our intentions as we become successful and as we do better and better for ourselves, hopefully, we want to then pass that on and leave a easier and better life if we were to be gone for our families. And I think in a lot of ways that's exactly what he did by positioning I don't know the size of his estate or what kind of life insurances he left, but what he did leave was he left book rights for a best-selling, book, and then that turned into movie rights, and of course that turns into royalties that benefits the families.
Well, he left a legacy of service too, because he has this foundation that's helping, vets that are suffering PTSD.
Yeah. And there's so much need in that community that even just the fact that he brought it to light, I think, helps.
Oh,
right?
Absolutely. Everybody's a lot more aware of what's going on now. You hear about PTSD a lot. You hear about those kind of post-traumatic syndromes. It's terrible, and it's good that we know about that so we can be aware and be able to help as well.
There's a lot of need, and I do some work with local charities also that work with the military community and specifically with people who are suffering from some of those kind of disorders. I think that the more exposure that we get as a public to what affects people when they come back from service, the better. And at the end of the day, again, Chris Kyle went from being a very private individual with a private life to being a public individual, and of course, having a larger estate, and that can paint a target on you. So next week we're going to be talking about how, as a professional or as somebody who has significant net worth, who maybe has done well for themselves, how can you protect yourself from having that target on your back, from lawsuits and so on and so forth, and protect your estate and your family after you're gone. We'll be joined by Raymond Ramirez from Revolution Financial Management. So join us next week on Remember Me. Thanks for tuning in.